it's nice working for like, a bigger institution where that pressure isn't all on me. So I apologize if, I see a lot of names that are kind of familiar. So I have like a limited repertoire of stories. So if these are repetitive for any of you, apologies in advance, but my career really did start with gonorrhea. So I didn't have it, but I used to give it to mice. So I was in graduate school in 2006 through 2011, and I worked in emerging infectious diseases. So we had to choose a lab, and I was very interested in the host response to basically infectious disease, whatever that was. So I started in a lab that had a female mouse model of gonorrhea. And my claim to fame is that I am the first person to have given a mouse both gonorrhea and chlamydia, which sounds kind of messed up, I know, but it's actually very common in young women in the United States and around the world. So that was kind of my claim to fame. And that's what my basic science research was in. I spent a lot of time at the bench for about 6 years, but I was really fortunate because my mentor, she actually gave me things to do that, at the time I felt like, oh, she's having me do her work. This is silly, but it was really part of this learning process. And so she let me, edit grants and write sections of grants and review grants with her and review manuscripts with her. And all of those experiences were just so valuable. So then I didn't actually know that science writing was a legitimate job. I feel like it's, everybody writes about what they do, but, I didn't know that you could just write about science. So one day when I was almost done with my PhD, I had a shipment of 50 mice with a genetic mutation in a TLR4 gene that was supposed to come in, and they didn't come. And I was so angry that I called my fiance, now husband, and I said, all right, fly me to Wisconsin. He was already there for Thanksgiving. So I flew to Wisconsin, and we happened to drive past the Marshfield Clinic. And I was like, hey, I wonder if a place like that would hire a person like me. And they had a science writer position open. And so I thought, I'm good at writing. I'm good at writing about science. So I took the job as a science writer. And, I kind of fell in love with the writing process and supporting clinical care. It was really different than the basic research that I had done. And then I really fell in love when I started doing some kind of community programming grants. So I know some of you through some of that work where, the Hope Consortium was kind of my first big foray into bigger community-based projects. And I ended up following the Hope Consortium grant into a new department and again, into Family Health Center Marshfield. So I really love what I do. And I feel like I came about it through a circuitous route, but all the experiences that I've had up until now, even giving mice gonorrhea and chlamydia, have really contributed to what I do. So that's kind of my expertise and where I come from in terms of a grant writer is basically I've done it a lot. And so I like to talk about it. But I know that a lot of you have probably written grants as well. So in addition to any questions or anything in the chat box, please feel free if you have like a very different opinion, or if there's some other tool or something that you found useful, please do add that to the chat. I've given this once before in person, a similar talk, and it worked really well. There were other grant writers in the room, which made me nervous, but at the same time, there was a lot of different idea sharing. So that's kind of my caveat over the whole presentation is that these are my ideas about grant writing, and another grant writer might do it in a different way. And even depending on the grant, sometimes, I change my own style. So take everything I say with a grain of salt, try it. If you like it, use it. If you don't, try something else or ask another person who's had some success. So today I am going to talk about 4 kind of bigger groups of topics. I'm going to talk about how to identify funding opportunities. The biggest chunk of the presentation is really going to be on the preparation of those grants, because I know that that's kind of the part that is scary to folks. I'll talk a little bit about the review process, and then just some different ways to kind of improve your grant writing skills, in my opinion, again. So before I go into kind of those different topics, I really wanted to give kind of 3 overarching themes that I think are really important in all of these areas and for all grants. The first being that relationships are absolutely essential. I mean, it's kind of cliche at this point to say it, because I know we all say we're breaking down silos, but the silo analogy is just so true. I mean, a lot of you, I'm sure, are in the substance use disorder prevention field, but it's hard to imagine that your work doesn't bleed over into prevention, treatment, and recovery. I mean, even when somebody is in recovery, then, we're talking about that secondary, tertiary prevention. So, we really have to work across our silos. And then in prevention, you guys are some of the best at breaking down silos between different kind of agencies. So you might have this law enforcement group working with a treatment group, working with a school group. So those kind of silos also exist in our communities. And that's very true also in the grant world. So, if you're working with a law enforcement agency and a grant comes out through DOJ, they may be more likely to see it than you would if you're in like a healthcare facility. So really having those relationships kind of something that's an ongoing task, not something you can really write into a work plan, but as much time as it takes to have those conversations and to meet people, you know, when we're allowed to meet people in person again, just to, you know, go on a restaurant tour of some of the communities that you serve, ask for recommendations, ask if you can meet someone there. It is always, always worth the time. I just can't say that enough about how important relationships are in grant writing. And when those relationships are genuine and those relationships are something that you've cultivated over a long period of time, I really think that that comes through in the stories that you'll tell. And that's the second point, is really about stories. So we've all read grants that are dry as a bone. We've all read, you know, texts for school and everything that are just dry. But, you know, even the boring stuff, I feel like we can always turn into a story. And when we turn it into a story, our reader becomes engaged. And it's really important to remember that the person who's reading your grant application, scoring it, and making the decision to fund you is a person just like you. And they're going to be much more interested if they are reading a story. We've always been interested in stories since we were kids. The same holds true today. And then the last big point I want to make is that feedback is fertilizer. So we all live in Wisconsin for the most part. So we know that in the springtime, our fields get covered in some wonderfully smelling stuff that, you know, helps the crops to grow. It stinks for a little while. It's disgusting when we store it. It's not any fun when it comes out of the back end of a cow, but it does help everything to grow. And I feel like as a writer and as a program developer, whatever you're doing in your community to make it better, all of that feedback, while it can be kind of hurtful and stinky and unpleasant at first, like it does help us grow, especially if we do the right thing with it. So that's kind of another big point, is that as much as it sucks, the feedback really does help things to grow and help you to get better. So first off, talking about identifying grant funding opportunities. So when I was in high school, my parents one time thought that we would go on this awesome trip, and they packed out me and my brother and sister in the car and we drove to Colorado. And it was the worst experience of my life because I'm a planner and I was so mad. I'm like, well, where are we going to stay tonight? Well, we'll find a place. Well, what are we going to do when we eat? What are we going to do when we get there? You know, I was just in this like absolute panic the entire time, the whole way there, the whole way back. There were just no plans. So as a planner, it's nice to know what's coming ahead. However, my parents taught me a valuable lesson, because the older I get, the more I keep saying, oh, they knew what they were doing, in that there's always these road signs along the way, right? And you can see if there's a hotel, if you need gas, if you need food, you can make a decision. You know, sometimes you pull off the exit ramp and the hotel is full, so you got to keep going a little further. But, you know, there's always these road signs along the way. And I feel like with writing grants, you and your agency are in that same situation. You're in a van with your parents and maybe you're hungry, maybe you need a little bit of gas, maybe you need to stop for the night, but you need to look for these road signs. And that's really where identifying grant opportunities comes from. You have to think about kind of where you started, where is your agency now, what needs do you have, what tools do you have at your disposal, and most importantly, like I talked about with the relationships, is who do you know? I can't remember the last time that I identified a grant opportunity. Like I was perusing the internet and I saw a grant opportunity and I thought, hey, let's apply for that. That was just not something that I think happens very often to people. More often than not, somebody forwards it to you. They're maybe on a list from SAMHSA or from DHS. Sorry, my mouth is dry. And they know, hey, you know, this would be a great fit for your agency, or have you seen this? Or do you want to partner with us on this? So more often than not, it's kind of those road signs along the way that tell you like, hey, this might be a good fit, or, you know, what do you need that this particular grant can address. So again, the cultivating the relationships is going to be the biggest part about identifying grants. And also, if you do have a particular interest, or you know, say DHS funds work like yours, it doesn't hurt to see if they have a mailing list or something. And oftentimes those will have not only grant opportunities, but they'll have a lot of resources and stuff too. So it's kind of that double win. You might be seeing a grant opportunity that way, but you might also identify some new resources that can be really helpful. And I will tell you that one of my favorites is SAMHSA. So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, they kind of, I think, put all their lists together. So you'll get grant funding opportunities. You'll also get tips, which are kind of the new, like, best and brightest in the field. So there's a ton of good resources that come out that way. And it can just be a way of growing not only, you know, your funding pool, but also your resource awareness. So you do get all these emails, right? And people are forwarding you these grants. And the important thing to keep in mind then is that time and energy are finite resources. You cannot spend all of your time writing grants. You only have so much time in the day. You only have so much energy to do your work. And if you're constantly chasing funding, especially if you're trying to like fit that square peg into a round hole, you're not using your time and energy wisely, and you're kind of taking away from the work that you need to do in the community. So there's a lot of things that you can need to consider, when you're writing that grant. Some of that was on that last slide, thinking about what tools you currently have, what are your needs, how close in alignment is this grant? I know I just saw that there are a couple folks on from Three Bridges Recovery. And, when you see a grant come out that says, a peer recovery community grant, you just think, oh my gosh, well, we have to apply for it. But, when we went deeper, I said, well, here's what they're going to require in this grant application of you to do. You have to do this many hours a week. You have to have your doors open like this, and it was, is this actually aligned with what your organization does or wants to do? And if it's not, we need to pass on this, even though it seems like, well, of course we should do this. We're one of a few organizations of this type in the state. So one of the most important things I think in that conversation is making sure that you're engaging your stakeholders. So none of us works in a vacuum. A lot of you are in public health or in different kinds of like collaborative organizations. And so it's important that we're not making these decisions to go for a grant on our own. Most of us are going to be writing our community partners into the grant. So we really need to be engaging with our stakeholders in whatever way that we can. And a lot of times that's done before the grant opportunity even comes out. So I wanted to give you an example here of one of the ways that we do this when we have kind of stakeholders for a grant and, we see a grant opportunity come out. How do we then talk to our stakeholders? So this was for the Hope Consortium, which some of you may be familiar with. It's up north in north central Wisconsin, well, way north, the Northwoods. So we've been working together since 2015, I believe. So it's been a long time coming. And as we were working together as a group, we kind of kept coming across these huge numbers of children that were affected. And that was a problem for everyone, but, we didn't have any way to do anything about it. So, we tried to reach out to like debt groups and we have those connections and everything. But again, all of us were kind of struggling with how do we make that connection? Well, this opportunity came out for, it's a federal grant for a neonatal abstinence syndrome grant. And it was a quick turnaround time. We didn't have a ton of time, but what we did is we put together this one pager. And so this one pager has kind of what the funding opportunity is so that our partners could go look that up if they wanted to see the full thing. But then we also have a brief summary at the top where it talks about the timeline for the award, like how quickly are we going to need to turn this around, what our likelihood of getting the award is. There's 30 across the US, it's this many dollars over this time period. We put the goal of the grant and then what their defined target population is. And then what you see in the body of this example is that in regular Black font, we put in there kind of what we were proposing. The grayed out font is then what else was in that funding opportunity. So that invites not only the stakeholder to become engaged, but also to review like, well, what are we skipping out of this opportunity? And is there a way that we can realign? So we had some really great conversations. The back of this document, although nothing is printed anymore, but the second page really talked about if you decide that you would like to partner with us to do this grant work, what does that request look like for you? What are you committing to by committing to be a partner in this work? So that went really well. We ended up getting that grant, and I'm super proud because that was the first time I ever got 100% on a grant. So I feel like I should just retire now, but so that's going really well. And I really think that the strength of that proposal was that our Hope Consortium partners knew this was a problem. We've been talking about it for 5 years. So when this opportunity came out, we were like, oh, we're ready. We know what the problem is. We know how to talk about the problem, and we know what our needs are. We're ready to go for this funding opportunity. So I don't think it was so much about my writing skills as much as my ability to share a true story about how important this was to this group of people. So another really important stakeholder group that I think is far too often overlooked, and I'm sure a lot of you, especially those of you in public health and prevention, are very familiar with the importance of engaging directly affected individuals. But we really need to do that even before our funding happens, unless we don't have the time and energy, and in which case we're trying to write a grant to specifically engage individuals that are to be involved in the programming. So I like this example because here's our handsome hero running away from a dinosaur, and I could have the best idea for building a dinosaur containment fence in the world, and I could have this beautiful proposal for putting it together. I can request funding, but putting that in is not going to help this dude. He is going to get eaten by that dinosaur well before I can do anything about this fancy fencing, So we really need to be asking people, what is your experience like on a day-to-day basis, and what does that mean for the projects that we want to implement? And sometimes that does change the direction that you go, but I mean, that's what we're all here for, right? We're trying to support our community in ways that matter to the community. So one other thing that I think is really exciting is that in recent years, we've seen a lot more opportunities to actually compensate consumers for their feedback. And I think that this is really important because it shows that we truly value the time and lived expertise of these people who are willing to give us their feedback. So that's been, I think, a real win, especially with some of our federal HRSA grants. They've been much more open to that. And like at first it was like $15 and then $25, and now it's $35. So if somebody participates in a focus group, usually we'll give like a gas card or something. But we've had a lot of success, not only in getting people to engage that way, but then you start building those relationships with people who are actually going to be consumers of your program. And then those same people might transition into being, advisors on some of your work groups, or they might just be full participants. A lot of people that are directly affected also might be working in a field that's similar or close to. So, we've had now a lot of people with lived experience that are actually engaging in the process of doing the work. And it's been a really, really important transition, I think, in the work that we're doing. So just one example of that and how valuable it can be. So for one of our grants, which is a Rural Communities Opioid Response Program Implementation Grant through HRSA, we were able through a planning grant to do a couple focus groups. And we did focus groups with directly affected individuals, as well as doing community stakeholder interviews. So we talked to people who were like maybe running a transitional shelter and said, how is substance use disorder in our community affecting your work? And so we got some great feedback, and we partnered with the Wisconsin Institute for Policy and Public Service. And not only did they prepare a beautiful report for us, but they said, hey, this is a population that we're not routinely engaging on any of the work that we do. How can we fix that? So there was like huge value in making that connection. But then also you can see here just the example of how we used that information, quotes from people, whether the first one here on the upper right is the community stakeholder interview quote where they said, we've been trying to work with the jails on a reentry program because people come out at 5 a.m. in the morning. If they've been in for 5 months or whatever, today, which is winter, they come out with their shorts and flip-flops and t-shirt on and have no place to go except back to the place where they were using. Really, we are setting people up for failure as they come out of jail. So I can give you like 1,000 different pieces of evidence about why reentry is hard, but in that one statement from a community stakeholder, it really says it all. I mean, you're imagining now this person standing outside of jail in flip-flops in December in Wisconsin and thinking, okay, this isn't good. We have to do something about this. And then similarly, we have this this quote down at the bottom. This is from a focus group participant, so somebody who is in recovery from substance use disorder, who said, we have a sheriff now who is oriented towards addiction recovery. I go over to the jail now and do some education. It's definitely a move forward. So if we're talking about stigma, which is kind of this like nebulous, vague concept, and then you see somebody who's experienced stigma and has seen the effects of stigma getting reduced, I just feel like all the words on the page are nothing compared to those single quotes. So not only is this valuable in determining kind of the direction of our work, but to a funder and to a reviewer looking at this, it's showing the impact that we can have through our programming in very simple and story and kind of I think emotion driving ways. So you've decided that you want to apply for a grant application. What does that look like? And like I said, this is going to be kind of the meat and potatoes of the presentation, because I know that this is the part that is scary, but my first message to you is that you can do it. You can absolutely do it. So in 2015, I was mad at my body and I was like, all right, we're going to do something different. And so I ran a marathon. And I know you can see me on your screen. If you're calling in, I don't look like a person that's going to run a marathon, but I did it. I trained for 18 weeks and I did it using this, a guy, his name is Hal Higdon. He's like this running guru. And he had a program, basically. It's not quite as limited as like the Couch to 5K, but it is, it starts you off slow. And it's basically, you can do it if you put in the time and energy. I think the same is true of a PhD. If you're willing to sit around for 7 years and work hard on nights and weekends and holidays, you can get your PhD. And if you want to put in the work, you can get a grant too. I mean, all of you are really good at what you do, and you can get grants by sharing those ideas with funders. It's just a matter of putting in kind of that dedication and training. And so I just love the quote, the one appeal of running is you can overcome a lack of natural ability with dedication and training, because I feel like that is me to a T. I just tried hard, and so I made it work. I didn't win the marathon, but I finished, and they give you a medal even for finishing those. So the best place to start is really your scaffolding. So if you think about building a grant as like building a building, you kind of got to start with the outside. You can't just jump in and start writing your ideas. There are a lot of things that are kind of specific to the funder that you're going to want to have in mind as you get started. So I'm going to give you just a couple examples of things that I use typically when I get started writing a grant. Some of these I use like all together. Sometimes I'll use just one or another. The first thing that I truly always do when I start a grant is build a template. And this is going to sound really archaic, but I actually hand type this. So even if I'm able to get the funding announcement in a PDF format, I don't copy, or in a Word format, I don't ever copy and paste. I always type in all of the information from the funding announcement because it forces me to read it, to not gloss over it. And I don't know, maybe I'm training my fingers to like write those words again, but I feel like this works really well for me because before I even start writing the grant, I have a grant application that's ready to be like, put together and it's formatted in the right way. So what I'm showing here in blue, so this is an example of a grant that I just made the template. This is before I started writing anything. In blue are the section headings. So a lot of times when they describe what your narrative is going to look like, they'll say, you need to have these sections. Sometimes they'll even have like, Roman numerals or numbers. You need to number it this way. And the numbering can be kind of funky. So, I always I put that kind of stuff in here. I just put it all in to my template right away. Then I usually include both the evaluation criteria as well as the application instructions, because you don't necessarily know what the reviewer is going to be seeing in terms of like they see something about, oh, this person had to write this. If they don't see it in there, then they could dock you points. And maybe it was in the application instructions or maybe it was in the evaluation criteria. So I always put them both in there. And that's just a reminder to me to kind of make sure I hit all those points when I'm writing the section. The other thing about that I do here, and this is just for my own convenience, I think, is I usually keep all of the instructions and all of the evaluation criteria. I keep that in like a gray font. Anything that's going to be like stay in the grant, I put in the dark black font. Like this is my actual grant. So this is something that I've never stopped doing. Actually, I mean, I do this literally with every grant that I've written probably in the past 10 years. Another one, and I have Brian Blahnik to thank for this. This I thought was just a genius idea. So this is particularly helpful if you're having meetings with stakeholders where you kind of need to come to some sort of decision about different elements to put in your grant. Grants are overwhelming to people, especially when there's lots of words on the page. So what Brian did is like when we were starting writing the Marshfield Clinic Health System AmeriCorps Recovery Corps grant, he would put together a question set for the group of people that we were meeting with that day. So you can see these are just simple questions like, okay, well, how many people do we want to have? Where do we want to put them? And what do we want them to do? So that was like our first question. And so as we kind of walked through this page, they were writing the grant with their words without even recognizing it. So you can come up with whatever questions you need to know. So obviously like a different stakeholder group is going to have a different set of questions that would be valuable, that their input would be valuable on. So, I've made several different sets of questions for as I meet with different people. Sometimes I'll call it like a data interview and I'll ask people like, hey, can I just call you on the phone and interview you? And I just walk through the same questions for all of these folks that I'm calling. And so if I may be calling Clark County Health Department and the Wood County Health Department and the Portage County Health Department, I'm going to kind of get a picture now of what the health departments are seeing. And that's data too for your grant. So we always think of data as being these like, big numbers and showing that it's the worst here. But I think that anecdotal data and the qualitative data are just as important, especially when you think about putting the numbers that you're seeing into the context of a story. And then the last kind of preparatory example I wanted to show you is a task list. So the one on the left is one when I was a science writer in the Office of Scientific Writing and Publication. That was with Marshfield Clinic Research Institute. We would put together this kind of template, and then for every grant, every time we were talking with a new kind of clinical provider who wanted to write a grant, we would customize this. We put in the grant title and the application date. We would list out all the tasks, who's the responsible party, and when's the due date, and that can be really helpful for backtasking. Here's one that is an actual living example from February of this year. I think Megan and Jesse are on, so that's all these are their responsibilities. But this timeline, basically, we put together all the application components. We knew we didn't have a long time, so we put down who's responsible, what the timeline is, and we did this together. We populated this, as a group. So does this make sense? Can you do this? Is this timeline going to work for you? I need that piece before I can do my part. So this really makes it a real thing, and it kind of generates not only the timeline that you need, but also that commitment. And it makes people say like, oh yeah, I can do that. I see my name in black and white. This is my job. So that's been a really helpful tool for us. It just in terms of being able to follow up as well. Hey, I'm looking at the timeline. You were supposed to have this done by then. Did you do it, or can I help you? How does that look? So then with grants, I've kind of talked about some of like the weird things and all these, like, you can see in the timeline, there's all these different pieces. So, generally when we're writing, there's some wiggle room, except when we are writing a grant. There is just no wiggle room. If there is something that they explicitly say you need to do, you need to do it, and don't ignore it, don't avoid it. Even if it seems silly or it seems redundant, or, like they ask for the same thing in 2 sections, put it in 2 sections unless they explicitly say that you can, refer to another section, because a lot of times they'll explicitly say you cannot refer to another section. It's just kind of making things as easy as possible for the reviewer, and it sucks really big to have your grant rejected on a technicality. If, for example, your HRSA grant was 11 pages over because you misread, what would count as an attachment toward the page limit, it really, really sucks when you don't even get reviewed. You don't even know if you were competitive. You have no idea if your project was a good idea or not, because you were just thrown out in the technical review. I'm just saying, for example, that could have happened to somebody that I know, and they might have cried a lot about it. So giving page limits as an example, it seems silly and it seems like such a minor point, but it is not a minor point at all. And I love to give this AmeriCorps example. So you can see here, AmeriCorps has a kind of funky system for submitting grants to the national, like they have a portal, and you have to basically write up your stuff, then you copy and paste it in, and then you have to fix everything that didn't copy and paste in right, like an apostrophe turns into the upside down question mark and all that kind of stuff. So they tried to give you an idea of what kind of, page limit you should be shooting for. So they tell you that to get an idea, to make sure that you're in the right kind of limit, you should use margins of, on the top 1.56. I mean, like, who has margins of 1.56? That's just like mind blowing. But they are trying to do you a favor. So when we were writing the initial draft, before we copied and pasted it in, we went ahead and made our margins 1.56 and 1 and 1 and 0.65, and we used Georgia 11 point font with 1.5 line spacing. We still ended up being over the page limit when we copied and pasted it into the system and then printed it back out. So we did have to cut some things, but we were a lot closer than I think we would have been if we'd just been guessing. So there really are some weird, rules, but it's worthwhile to follow them. Another thing that you can use on that timeline that I mentioned back here is a lot of times we'll put kind of page counts in here. So, they'll tell you this should be approximately 1 page, this should be approximately 2 pages, or so on and so forth. Or we'll say, this doesn't count toward the page limit. So we'll make notes about that on the timeline. And that can help, especially if you're breaking sections up between different people, because somebody could give you a beautiful 10-page, abstract, and you're like, oh, well, that's our whole grant now. So it's just a nice way, again, of keeping people kind of with the guidelines in mind without having everybody memorize that big, thick FOA packet. So I've been talking about like this grant does that and this grant does that. And I mean, it's true, grant requirements really are diverse, and you're going to have to look at each individual grant to see what they want. You can't even generalize like from, one Wisconsin agency to another. I've written a lot of DOJ and a lot of DHS and DCF grants. They're all completely different. They have different requirements all over the place. Here's just a quick example of 4 different funders that I thought was kind of a nice cross section of federal and philanthropic and different kind of grant requirements. And you can see, I mean, they're super variable. There's a lot of differences between them, and that does make it hard, when you're trying to think about using your time wisely, because it's nice to have things kind of on hand about your program that you can cut and paste or use again in another grant. So with that in mind, even though, people are diverse, people still have the same basic parts. We all have the liver, we all have some lungs, we all have a head, so there are these basic parts, and grants are kind of the same way. So grants, I think, in my opinion, and again, somebody else might have a different opinion, this is just kind of my thoughts on grant writing after, several years doing it. I really think that there are 5 basic sections to a grant that we need to think about as we're writing to the funder. So Muggles beware. If you have not read the Harry Potter series, I apologize. My next 5 slides are all Harry Potter themed. So if you have read it, hopefully this really resonates with you. But the first kind of section that I want to talk about is the problem section. And so it really is talking about what are we trying to do in our community, or what are we trying to fix in our community? What is not going well now or needs to be better that we want to address? So you might see it called a section on need, or a section on called the problem statement. So it could kind of go under some different names, but in general, they want to know what's wrong in the community. Interestingly, there are some grants that will tell you what's wrong right in the grant. So, I've applied for several that are kind of geographically targeted, where, they'll say, okay, Oneida County, Price County, Iron County, Vilas County, and Forest County, they have a rate of this, that is this, and therefore we want you to do that. Sometimes that's enough for them and they won't have a need section. More often than not, there's still a need section. And so it's a great idea to just say, like you said, these counties have this problem at this rate. It's redundant. You know, they already know it, but still they want you to talk about what that need is and that you really understand the need in your community. So some tips kind of for writing about the problem. It's a great idea to use really clear language, not make it too muddy, like, well-being is poor. Well, what does that really mean? Like what about the well-being of a person is impacted by this problem? If you have numbers or an evidence basis for that problem, put those in. That's always really great, even if it's just like a small sample size. In our program, we serve this many people who had this issue. Therefore, we know this is a big problem. So numbers are really valuable, even if they're not, big national numbers that come out of the CDC. Finally, it's really important to make the threat. If you don't give us this money, the world is going to end because of this problem. It's bad news. So really talking about the negative consequences of not solving the problem. You don't want to be really negative in terms of like we're going to fail without this, but more along the lines of, we really need to do this. Otherwise, the next generation is going to be impacted for years to come. So those kinds of statements, I think, can really emphasize the importance of the problem in your community. The next part is the solution. So what are you going to do about this problem? You've described the problem, and now how are you going to address it? So in a grant application, in that sometimes they're called, I'm going to use the terms probably interchangeably, but they might be called a request for proposal, request for applications, which would be RFP or RFA. The state of Wisconsin has recently switched mostly, at least through DHS, to GFO, which is grant funding opportunity. But you'll see kind of all of those, they're all exactly the same thing. It's basically just an announcement telling you that we have money to give away. Do you want some? Let us know. So the solution is really how you're going to solve the problem. You might see it listed as an intervention, a strategy, approach, project description. There's lots of different ways that they're going to ask you to tell them what you're going to do. And sometimes they ask you more than once to tell them what you're going to do. And just tell them every time exactly like they asked it. Give them the details that they provide. They're going to want to know the basics. Who is doing it? What are they doing? Where are they delivering the services? When are they going to be provided? And why are they going to be provided? It's really important, if possible, that you can link back your solution to your problem. So we know that this problem happens because of this, so we're addressing the thing that we know causes the problem. If you can connect those two, you're telling a more cohesive story. And almost every grant will have then a work plan document. Sometimes it's called something different. It might be called project milestones or timeline or something, but a work plan is a very kind of normal part of a grant. So I included in this presentation just a couple different work plans for you to see. So this is an example of one that was from a state of Wisconsin grant through the Department of Health and Human Services. And they have basically a template that you have to use. It's terrible because you cannot insert or delete rows. Also, the formatting is, sometimes you can format, sometimes you can't. So this is a nightmare and you should start early, but it is what it is. And you got to turn this in with every kind of contract that you apply for. So I recommend starting early, but here's kind of one example, but you can see it kind of has all the same elements. These are all going to have the same elements where they talk about what are you trying to do? That's your goal or your objective, the activities that you're going to undertake or the strategies you might undertake. When is it going to happen? What does that timeline look like? And some funders are more stringent than others. Like in this, we're able to say we're doing this on an ongoing basis. We're doing it now. We're going to keep doing it thanks to your funds. Some are not going to like that, and you're going to have to actually give, dates. We actually had a HRSA application recently where they wanted us to go ahead and make that activity, like write it 3 different times with the timelines for the 3 different years that are funded. So you kind of just have to pay attention to what the RFA is asking. And then the how success will be measured, that might be deliverables, is basically what's going to happen because you did that activity. So this is a HRSA example. This is a federal work plan, but again, it's very much the same kind of information where we talk about the goal and the outcomes that we want to have happen, our objective, the activities related to that objective, who's going to do the work, when does it start, when does it end, and what are the deliverables from doing that work. You can also use the work plan to kind of sneak some things in that are helpful to the reviewer. So for this grant, you can see at the top, maybe not, it's probably really small on your screen, but they had some kind of required activities. So we had to have like 5 required prevention activities, 3 required treatment activities, so many required recovery activities, and they all had numbers. And so we used superscripted numbers. So we would say like prevention, like P1, and we would put that next to our activities. That way, if the reviewer is looking through this and saying, are they really doing everything that we said they had to do, they could find it in the work plan. And so we had that labeled throughout. None of them are on this first page, but that was something that I think really helped us because our project elements didn't align exactly, with what their tasks were. They didn't line up in order. So that way they could see that they were all covered in the work plan. And then this one was really different. So this one was for the Wisconsin Association for Perinatal Care, and it still has all the same elements. They wanted to know what you're doing and when and why and all of that, but they had a very different format. And so one of the things that I usually do when I put a work plan in is at the very top, I use their words to tell them, I'm giving you exactly what you asked me for. So on this one, it says the table below details the work plan for the proposed project, including a description of the target population engagement, key strategies and activities within the context of the theory of change. Those words would have come right out of their instructions for a work plan. So I'm basically just saying, I'm giving you exactly what you want, promise, and then I do it. And the same thing for these other work plans. The work plan below details the responsible individuals, timeframes, and deliverables for each proposed project activity over the 3-year performance period. And in this one in the instructions, it made it very clear that your work plan should be for all 3 years, not 1 year. So I put that right in my note to them. I'm telling you what I'm going to do over the entire 3-year performance period. So after you kind of figure out what you're going to do, they want to know what evidence do you have kind of to back this up? How are you going to prove that you're doing what you say you're going to do? It might be called outcomes or outcome measures, evaluation tools, or performance measures. The thing that I think is really important to note about this section is a lot of times there are required reporting elements. They tell you, you have to report to us X, Y, and Z. In addition, how are you going to show us that what you're proposing works? So it's always a good idea to report both things back to them. Tell them what you plan to measure, whether it's something that they're requiring or something that you're using specifically, related to your strategies and goals. What tools are you going to use? How often are you going to use those tools to make the measurements? And how often are you going to report? Even if the RFP says you are required to report to us on a 6-month basis, you say then, I will report to you on a 6-month basis the following things, and it's really okay to be redundant with the RFP because they're basically trying to check that box when they're reviewing. They're saying, does this person show me that they can meet the requirements of this grant? You're going to tell them exactly, the requirements of the grant that you're going to meet because it shows that you understand and that you've read the requirements. So 2 more sections. This one is really the funder. So they want to know, why are you applying to us? Like, why do you need money from us specifically and not somebody else? So they might be talking about alignment or priority, or even target population can sometimes have some elements of this. So a target population I know seems a little bit different. It seems more like the solution or the problem, but they might be saying like, why does our agency care about the people that you're targeting? So with the Wisconsin Association for Perinatal Care, if we said that we were focusing on families of young children, they might not have seen that as well aligned. They might have said, well, we're really focused on that perinatal period. Like, you've got to be within, the 9 months before birth, the birth period, or up to a year after birth. Otherwise, we're not really interested. So you just want to demonstrate with that target population that that you're addressing the needs of a population that they really care about. So you're going to talk here about your shared interest in the problem. Why does this matter to us, just like it matters to you, and how your solution really aligns well with the funder's goals. So you might be applying to an agency that has put out there kind of like evidence-based practices for addressing whatever problem. It's a great idea to refer to those things to say, as SAMHSA says, and you're, applying to SAMHSA, an intervention like this can be successful. So just really indicating to them that I get what you guys stand for, and we want to stand for the same thing in our community. And then finally, this is the point where you talk yourself up. So they're going to ask about the applicant. And this is always a section, well, not always, but more often than not, this section is at the end of a grant and you're tired of writing and you're like, oh, we just are who we are. Okay. Like, I'm done, you're out of space. But this part is really important because they want to know, and especially if they've never funded you before, they want to know why they should fund you. It might be called organizational capacity or capability. It might be called resources. It might be called investigators. And they're really interested in you telling the story of why you can achieve what you say you're going to achieve with this money. So it's very important that you make yourself look good. You describe kind of your organization as a whole, the partnerships that you have. For a lot of us who are doing work in the community, we can't be kind of those helicopter folks that come in, drop the food and go away. You know, we need to really be engaged with our community. So this is another good spot where you can really talk about your partnerships with the community. Talk about, you know, how often you attend community coalition events, or, you know, if you have like some sort of informal working relationship with another agency, how often do you meet? How often do you connect? What comes of those meetings? So these are the kinds of things that I think can really help you to stand apart from an agency that maybe is coming in from out of town and wants to address a problem or put up a brick and mortar site when they don't really know, you know, the community. That happened with the Hope Consortium, you know, that I talked about up in the northern region. There were some, you know, companies, some bigger companies that said, well, we can go up there, we can build a facility and we can provide substance use disorder treatment. And if you build it, they will come, right? It worked in the Field of Dreams, it's going to work in the Northwoods. But that, I mean, that's not real. That's not going to happen. You can't put a facility in Rhinelander and assume that folks from, you know, Phillips and from Crandon are going to be able to get there easily, regularly, on, you know, numerous times a week. So really demonstrating that understanding of the place in which you're functioning is going to be an important part of this as well. So again, this is kind of that overarching theme that I wanted to make a point of bringing back to the forefront, because those all seem kind of formulaic, all of those sections. You know, you got to check the boxes, you got to meet these things. But if you can do it in a way that also tells a story, if you can connect those sections, like I said before, because of this problem, this solution is a really good idea, and we support that population now by doing this. You kind of keep weaving that through, telling that story, and turning it into something that's enjoyable to read, as opposed to just, you know, question answer, you're going to really do a better job. And I'm pretty sure that that's what Plato was actually referring to when he said those who tell the stories rule society, because grants have been around forever. So just like, you know, we talked about how people all have those same parts, I think it's really important to remember that the reviewer is a person. The reviewer is also your audience. And I think that that's a piece that people miss, because you think about your grant, you're really passionate about it, you're telling this great story. Maybe you wrote it for your boss because your boss is going to be wowed by this great program that you've come up with. Maybe you've even been writing to kind of the directly affected consumer, telling them, here's what I'm going to do for you, it's going to be amazing. But those aren't the people who are going to be scoring your grant and deciding whether or not they're going to give you money. So I think it's really important to remember that the reviewer is a person just like you. Reviewers get grumpy just like you. Personally, as a grant reviewer, I have left all the grants I had to review until like the day before my reviews were due, and then had to stay up really late. And I was definitely moody while I was, you know, reviewing them. And so a happy reviewer is going to be a higher scoring reviewer. So what do you do to make a reviewer happy? That is kind of the $1 million question, literally. It's whatever it takes. So you have to remember who your audience is, and you have to make that audience happy. It's going to affect your score if you make things hard to find in your grant application. It will affect your score if you have silly typos all over that, you know, you didn't bother to correct. It's even going to affect your score. And I think I say this mostly to make myself feel better about being so anal retentive about formatting, but I really do believe that that first impression, seeing that page and seeing it be clean, easy to read, there's space, there is, you know, clear, you know, section headings. I think that those things really do affect your score, even if it's a very subconscious thing. I mean, obviously we want to believe that the reviewer is looking just at the merit of the program that I'm describing, but we're all influenced by a lot of other things besides just the content, just what the words say. There are a lot of other things that can make a person moody or make a person less favorable to your application. And those are things that you're going to want to address. So this is what I call my happy reviewer checklist. And these are the things that I spend an inordinate amount of time on kind of toward the end of an application. And I would highly recommend that you do too. First of all, make no assumptions. You know, they do their best, these different funding organizations do their best to find people that have some level of familiarity with the work that you're proposing to review applications, but they can't always find them, and it may not always be a perfect fit. So you should never assume that they know anything about your community, your organization, the interventions that you're proposing, or even the condition or the problem that you're trying to address. I mean, you really do need to back it up. And it may just be a sentence saying, you know, substance use disorder is very common. You know, I mean, these things, obviously, this person's going to know that substance use disorder is a problem, but why is it a problem in your community? You can't make any assumptions about what they know. Making the answers easy to find, I think, is really, really essential. So I showed you kind of that template, and I'm going to show you another example of how I use their words again, because that is what reviewers are looking for. If the funder told you, this is what you need to tell us, the reviewer has been told, this is what they were supposed to tell us, did they tell us? And so they're looking for those key things, those keywords and phrases. They're looking for those headings. They probably have a rubric or something that tells them what to look for. And so making those answers super easy to find is going to make your reviewer happy. Acronyms are a big one. And I know I come into this problem all the time where like I will, use an acronym and then I'll move some space, like move some sentences around. And now my acronym isn't defined until like the fourth use. That's super annoying to reviewers. They don't like it when they can't figure out what an acronym means. And I mean, these days, if you try Googling an acronym, you're going to get 50 different hits. So it's really important that if you're going to use an acronym, and I do think that using acronyms is okay, especially because when you're limited in space, having to say substance use disorder, like 100 times really takes up a lot of lines. So you're going to want to go with SUD, but don't assume that they know what SUD is. That first time you use it, say substance use disorder, in parentheses, SUD, now keep using SUD from there on out. With acronyms too, I recommend that you redefine them anytime you use them in a table or in a figure. So that way, if that table or figure is being viewed in isolation, separate from the rest of the grant, you have that definition right there. A lot of times in tables, I'll do that as maybe like a footnote. It might just say like at the very bottom of the table, use the acronym throughout. And then at the bottom of the table, I might have in italics like SUD, comma, substance use disorder, then semicolon, and then, WI, Wisconsin. So because you don't even know necessarily where your reviewers are coming from. So if you've got acronyms in there, define them. I think there are a few exceptions. So if you're writing like a grant about DNA, you do not need to say deoxynucleic ribonucleic or acid, whatever it is. You don't need to define these things that are really commonly known. But there are things that you should, like if you're writing about COVID-19, depending on your funder, you might want to say, coronavirus variant 2019 or SARS coronavirus. I mean, it depends on, you got to read your funder a little bit, but you want to be really careful with acronyms because I know I'm hammering this point home, but that's because it's a huge pet peeve, especially in the publishing world. And I have to believe that if it comes through in the publishing world, it's probably the same in the grant world. I mean, I've never seen a grant reviewer come back and say, I didn't fund you because of your acronyms, but I do think it's one of those kind of underlying things that can make people frustrated with your work. Spelling and grammar checked and rechecked. I don't know what it is about Word, but there's a certain point, I think, where you have so many errors or so many words it doesn't understand that it just quits, it gives up on you, and it stops doing the like red squiggly underline. So you might have to click spell check, because it's not doing that anymore and it's not auto correcting. So it's just, those are one of those things that is really worth it, especially if you have one of those words that's close to another word and now you're saying something that doesn't make any sense. It's worth it to just check and recheck. Beautiful formatting, again, is super important, and having that engaging narrative, which I've talked about all along, is really telling a story, making that person want to keep reading. So this is the example I kind of referenced about using the funder's words. So on the left-hand side, this is an example of a template I had just started. So I put the introduction section heading, I put it in black because I was going to leave that heading there. Then in gray, I kind of had their instructions for that. Now, then what you can see I did is I started adding then subheadings. So in the instructions, they asked me to succinctly summarize the overarching goal, the characteristics of the target population and rural service area, the proposed strategies, our history of collaboration, and our capacity to implement. So I went ahead and I added those as subheadings. So now as the reviewer is reading through this, they don't have numbers or anything. This isn't a grant that had like, section 1.2 should be your overarching goal. Instead, they just said, these are the things we want you to hit. So rather than the reviewer having to like look through and say, did they get this point? Did they get this point? I gave them those subheadings. Now I'm going to tell you about my overarching goal. That's one of the things you told me you wanted. Now I'm going to tell you about my target population service area. Again, one of the things that you said you wanted. Another thing I did here is before we even started writing the grant, I took from this over here on the right is actually just a little screenshot from their RFP, or that I think they call them an FOA, so funding opportunity announcement. So I took the words that they said, they bolded this. They said, the target population for this grant is pregnant women, mothers, and women of childbearing age who have a history of or who are at risk for SUD, OUD, and their children, families, and caregivers who reside in, and then blah, blah, blah. And I used that exact phrase. I said the population of interest for our proposed project includes pregnant women, mothers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I just said who reside in, and then I gave them the Forest, Iron, Price, Oneida. I gave them the counties. They also said in HRSA designated rural areas. So the next sentence in this grant ultimately was, these are entirely rural counties as designated by the HRSA Rural Health Grants Eligibility Analyzer. So just telling them exactly like, we are using your exact target population. There's no guesswork. We're doing what you asked. I guess too, another thing, a point about this is that it can make your grant easier to write. So You don't have to come up with the words. They gave you the words. Use the words. That's what they want, so just use the same words back to them and fill in around it. So grammar is another important thing, and it's annoying, but it's worth changing your sentence to get around some of those sticky grammar spots. Data are plural, it's plural word, so just things like that. Like if you're not sure, Google it. I really like Grammar Girl. She has kind of like a fun, as fun as grammar can be, way of explaining like how best to use something. And if it sounds awkward, even though it's grammatically correct, you might want to just go ahead and change your sentence to avoid using that awkward phrasing. It's just one of those things that I think can really affect like the mood of the person reading your work. So when you've got this beautiful grant written and you're in love with everything it says, but we get blind to our own words. So you can read the same thing over and over and over again, and you start reading what you want to read. And I can't tell you the number of times where I've gone back to a grant after it's been funded and I'm reading through it and I'm like, oh my God, the number of typos in this thing. Like, how did I miss this? And it's because your brain knows what this should say. You've been, hanging out with this grant for weeks now, and it says what you want it to say. So having all hands on deck, if it's somebody who's, like they work in your department, but they're not really involved in this project, have them read the grant, have them take a look at it for you, have them go through. If they see something that's like, I don't really understand what you meant here, don't say, oh, well, the reviewer will understand it. If they didn't understand it, the reviewer is not going to understand it, or there's a possibility that the reviewer won't. So that's worth then clarifying. And honestly, as cheesy as it sounds, have your mom read it, unless your mom is like a substance use disorder prevention expert, in which case, like you're kind of out of luck, maybe have grandma read it instead. But truly have somebody who's not in the know in your field read this thing. Make sure that this makes sense to a lay person, somebody who truly has no idea what you're trying to do or anything about your community. If they're willing to read it, take them up on that and take their suggestions to heart, because if they're confused about something, there's a very good chance that the reviewer will be too. So like I said, I really think that formatting matters, and it's totally worth the time to make your grant a beautiful grant. I just think it really affects the mood of the person who's reading it. There are situations in which it won't matter. So there are some submission systems where you just copy and paste your text right into a box, and then all formatting is lost and it looks ugly no matter what you do. But if you have the opportunity to upload a PDF of your work, really take the time to make it beautiful. And I just have a couple examples of why it matters. So a lot of places will tell you that you should use black and white or gray tones to put, share your work. We're not going to print any figures in color. So I just gave an example of what the submitted figure might look like versus how it might be reviewed. So on the left-hand side, if I left this figure in color and the reviewer is like me and doesn't like reading on the screen, so they decide to kill a tree and print the grant, they are going to see this ugly, kind of really hard to discern figure on the bottom left. If I take the time, and it is tedious to do this kind of stuff, but if I take the time and make my figure in gray shades, like it shows on the top right, when the reviewer then prints that off, they're going to see the same figure. So anything that you can make, in the actual body of your grant look like it's going to look when it prints, no matter how that person prints it in color or otherwise, it's really worth doing. The other thing worth noting here is on these figures, I spent a ton of time. This is an actual figure that we use in a grant, and I spent a ton of time changing the font after the figure was made. It was all beautiful and everything, and then we realized, oh, we were supposed to use a certain font. They didn't say we should use it in figures, but it's best to assume that we should also use it in figures. So, take the time to do those things. Don't assume that they don't matter. This is another example that I think is really important. So my mom used to always tell me to justify my work, which is that the far right button in the how is your text going to look in Word. I tried to like do a screenshot at the top there so you can see which button I'm talking about. And it really, look at that. Like this is just left and right. The only difference is that it's justified, and then I cleaned up the tables with some formatting. And this kind of stuff is so nitpicky that it's annoying, but I really think it affects like the tone and like the professional look of your grant. So I grew up in southern Michigan in a city called Ypsilanti, which you can see on this map. It's kind of right between Detroit and Ann Arbor. And about 45 minutes away, there is a little town called Hell, Michigan. And it's funny because hell freezes over and they post pictures of the town sign with like icicles on it. And there's this run through hell. So unrelated, I want to talk about submission systems for grants, particularly federal submission systems, which are nightmarish. So I had the fortunate opportunity recently to learn alongside a small agency who had never submitted a federal grant before what that process was like of making sure that they were able to do this. And it was pretty insane. I've got to say, I'm pretty disgusted with the way that this process works, because I feel like it does kind of systematically keep smaller agencies that don't have dedicated grants management folks out of the federal funding system. And that really bothered me. So I did include as one of your handouts a kind of quick guide to dealing with this hellish system that is grants.gov. So if you decide or you think you might ever apply for federal funding, it's worth now going in and making sure that you're registered with the 4 different systems and that they're connected in a way such that when the opportunity arises, your agency can hop in and do the work of actually, well, the additional work of creating a workspace and doing that. There's 4 different systems in there that you have to register for. The one that takes a really long time, ERA Commons, can take up to 6 weeks. And if you don't have an active account in any of these systems, you literally cannot apply for the grant. They don't make exceptions for these federal funders. And so I just think it would be a real shame if anybody, has the capacity to do this work or has, the perfect project for these funds and couldn't apply because of that, that reason. I know there are smaller agencies sometimes who will partner with bigger institutions. So for example, like the United Way, your local United Way might already have grants.gov account. So if they're willing to be the grant holder for you, then they can use their system to kind of submit that grant on your behalf. I know in some places, the UW schools will actually submit on behalf of community agencies. So that might be worth checking into if the federal process seems too arduous for you. But I tried to put it together kind of step by step and what we learned. So when I was working with Three Bridges Recovery, I mean, we were down to the wire trying to figure out, how do I make the eBiz person of contact? Like, what even is this? And the instructions online were long, and I was watching YouTube videos and none of them just seemed clear enough, and I do this for a living. So I was really disgusted by that. So if you do have any questions or you have any struggles, reach out to somebody who's done it or call the ERA Commons service desk and ask for some help. It's just worthwhile to take care of that now so that when you are writing a federal grant, you can focus on the application and you don't have to focus on the stupid grants.gov process. So the same is kind of true for any funding agency. There are some amazing agencies like Wisconsin DHS that allows you to just put it all in a PDF, attach it to an email and send it. But even DHS, like I think it was 2017 was the last time I had to print 5 copies, put them in a binder, put CDs in there, label the CDs a certain way, and then drive it down to One West Wilson to turn in these binders. I mean, so it's worthwhile to take a look at what the submission requirements are. DOJ, the Department of Justice for Wisconsin, uses this e-grant system where you copy and paste things into boxes online. So just setting up that workplace or that application package, whatever it is, as soon as you know you're going to apply for a grant, it's worth doing because that way then you're ready to go and you can spend less time focusing on that, or you can put somebody like in accounting on that so that you can focus on the actual project itself. Okay, so this next section is pretty brief because it talks about review. So there is this period between, you submitting this beautiful grant through the arduous system, whatever that may be, and you finding out via email that kind of we regret to inform you, or we are pleased to inform you that you did or did not get funding. So it's a pretty standard process, except when it's not, of course. Usually it is this vague period of time. They might tell you in the funding announcement, we should be making announcements by this date, but it usually says like approximately. And I know at least with like state grants, like very often the announcement won't come out until like after the contract should have started. So, don't freak out if you haven't heard anything back. It's not uncommon to not hear anything. Except then there are those situations where the grants are really different. And this is particularly true, I think, with like foundations. So the Wisconsin Partnership Program, for example, you usually do a pre-application, which is competitive, and then you have to do an actual application if invited. And then you get invited to do like a presentation in front of their oversight and advisory committee. So just pay attention in your packet. It's in whatever that funding announcement is, it should describe the review policy practices. And if it doesn't, then you can always reach out to the project officer and they can tell you kind of what that process is going to look like. So regardless of the process, you don't really get a say in it. Everything that you're going to do for the review is going to have to happen in advance. You're going to have to make it pretty. You're going to have to make it comply. You're going to have to check all those boxes. It's very rare that you get a second chance or they ask clarifying questions. I'm not saying that they never do, because sometimes they do, but it's pretty rare. So just keep in mind that your chance to speak was when you submitted that application. Even if you're really ticked about the results, they don't care. I mean, you don't get a vote in this case, the funder does. And again, it's kind of rare to get feedback. So the amount of feedback that I've gotten and the kind of completeness of that feedback has been pretty limited, but when you do get it, that is just like that manure is gold, like hang on to it, even though it sucks, you're going to have to go through the stages of grief. Like I can't tell you the number of times where I've been like, well, maybe there was a mistake. Oh my God, these reviewers are idiots. maybe I should have done this differently. I hate myself. I suck at grant writing. And then finally, like you can learn from it, and figuring out what you can learn from it kind of becomes that corn in the manure field. It really does help in your future grants. So you can use that as an exercise. You could respond either just like as a thought exercise, talk about it with your team. What could we have done differently to have avoided this reviewer feedback? Obviously, there are cases where that's not possible. If they say you just don't have enough individuals that would be eligible for a drug treatment court in your county to be eligible for this grant, there's nothing you can do about that, obviously. But you could say, well, are we willing to consider including individuals in this court who have this other condition? So just thinking through as a group, you could do it just as a thought exercise, or you could actually write it down and have it kind of ready to go. But using that feedback is a great way to have made the review process, even when it's negative, being like a positive for you. So Lisa, yes, there are going to be handouts. So they're linked online. And I think if you scroll up in the chat box, maybe you can see them too. So the same place you registered, the handouts that I talked about will be available to you for download. Otherwise, you can email me too, and I can always send you whatever you need. So improving your odds of success. Grant, I guess I don't know what I want to say about this, but grant success is, I don't want to say rare, but the best grant writers, and this is like a statistic that I have absolutely no backing for, but in all the presentations I've ever heard about grant writing written by or given by people who have professional jobs as talking about grant writing, they've always said that like the best grant writers in the world will have a 30% success rate, which is kind of dismal, right? Like that means that for every 10 grants you submit, you're going to get 3 of them. And that's really hard. We have the advantage being in the field of substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and recovery, that this is a very hot field right now. When rich white people started dying of opioids, suddenly everybody wanted to throw money at the problem. So we have this huge advantage in that there is a lot of money to be had. So we might be a little bit more successful than your typical grant writer who's maybe in the field of research. Just keep that in mind. But there are things that you can do to get better. And I think that the exciting thing about improving your odds at being successful is that it's a little bit less clear cut than this, but it's a lot more fun than this. So, you see these tabloid magazines or this clickbait that says, we're going to give you these 10 steps to the perfect grant that no funder will say no to. It's just like, that 2 days losing 10 pounds tabloid in the supermarket aisle. I mean, that's not reality. There is no one size fits all way to get better at writing grants or to ensure that your grant is going to get funded. There's so much variability that goes into it. And also remembering that there isn't a way yet for computers to review grants. So it's still a human being with their own kind of thoughts, feelings, and perceptions that's going to be reviewing your grant. So, there's a lot of variability that goes into it, and it's never going to be a sure thing. So my best kind of tips for improving your ability to get grants is to first read. Reading makes you a better writer, no matter what it is you're reading. And I am a firm believer in the fact that listening to audiobooks or listening to podcasts is a form of reading. Basically, any way that you're taking in information and understanding or learning ways, even just like through tacit examples. Anytime you're getting those examples of how to make a case, how to make a compelling argument, how to put sentence together in a way that makes like for a nice story, you're learning. So I have a really good example. This is an N=1 kind of example where my sister, who's brilliant, I mean, she's truly a brilliant person. She's a chemical engineer. She homeschools her kids, like for real homeschool, not just the way that I do with like virtual, like legit. So she's very smart. However, she never liked to read. She hated reading her whole life. And it really showed in her vocabulary. So when she was getting married, this is like 10 years ago now, she was getting married and she and her husband were like looking at all these honeymoon sites. And she came to my mom and I, she was really concerned because like everywhere that she was looking, it said that they had like an exotic location, and like she just wasn't really into that sort of thing. And it took me a minute because I'm like, like orchids are fun, right? Like umbrellas and drinks and everything. So she had confused the words exotic and erotic. And it just has been like my favorite story about my sister for all time. And I had to use it obviously in my like toast at her wedding because the poor thing, it was just too funny. I can't even imagine what that must have been like, going to every hotel site that said they were good for a honeymoon and thinking it was like, a porn party. So it was pretty great. But my sister now, it's interesting. She had kids and her oldest is an avid reader, like truly an avid reader. So my sister has reluctantly become a reader. She's even read the whole Harry Potter series. And interestingly, and I don't know if this is correlated, but I want to believe that it is, my brother and I were playing Scrabble with her a couple years ago, and she beat us both. And we are both like reading fools. We have good vocabularies. And when she beat us, like I get competitive with my brother. I wasn't even mad at my sister. I was just so impressed because she should never have won. I really think that reading has made her vocabulary what it is today, even if it is a little bit magical because of Harry Potter. So the other thing that you can do besides reading, because reading really does make you a better writer, is to write. So I think that it's so important to remember that the first words that you put down on the page don't have to be beautiful. Anne Lamott is an amazing writer. I highly recommend her. And anytime you get the opportunity to read a writer's thoughts on writing, I think it's totally worth it because they just have such like interesting things to say. So she says, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. And that's true. I mean, she's coined the term shitty first draft, and they are supposed to be shitty first draft. You're not supposed to have the beautiful words right away. What your goal is to get your ideas down on the page so that you can start massaging them from there. And I think that the thing that I've noticed the most about this recently is that as we've written into grants, our ability to help others to write their own grants, I'll a lot of times spend an hour on the phone with somebody. They tell me about what they want to do, and I send them back a draft of like a grant section. And they're like, oh, you are just the best writer. This is so amazing. I've never once written anything down that they didn't say to me. I mean, maybe I pulled a reference or something from PubMed, but the ideas for the programs are your ideas for the programs. Making them into beautiful words and beautiful sentences can happen later if you just get those ideas down on the page. That's the really important thing. And I'm trying to do that more and more, you know, with this whole idea of teach a person to fish as opposed to just fish for them, where, you know, we talk about like, look at the ways that we can put your ideas and words down onto paper. So you have to just remember that you're the expert, and you're the expert in what you do. You're the expert in the population you serve because you see them every day and you work with them every day. And you really just have to trust that about yourself when you're putting your pen to paper virtually, I guess. And so I just wanted to give an example of like, you know, I do this all day, every day, and I save every draft as a new, like every time I change something, I save it as a new draft just because maybe I like the way it was before better. So this is one of my favorites is when we were writing the Recovery Corps grant. You can see here that with our logic model alone, we got up to 6 drafts. And then with the narrative, we got up to 15 drafts over several days. And then after we stopped naming them drafts, we started naming them revisions of that last draft. So then it kept going down the revisions. I mean, this is normal and it's good because every time you have a new draft or a new revision, it's better. So just keep in mind that you don't have to be a good writer. It's just like that training for a marathon. If you're willing to put in the time and the energy, you can do it, whether or not it flows out of your pen beautifully, kind of that first go round. So I know that some of you are probably like me and they don't like the advice I've given because it's annoying and vague and like, where's the measurable outcomes, you know? But there are more formal strategies to improve your grant writing skills as well. So addressing reviewer comments, I realized, or like I mentioned earlier, is one of the best things that you can do. Learn from the people who've had criticisms of your work. There's also lots of webinars like this one. I know a lot of different like the technical assistance providers are starting to provide more webinars like this. So through HRSA, we have the Rural Communities Opioid Response Program. They've provided us with a ton of different technical assistance opportunities, and a lot of them have been around grant writing, work plan development, logic modeling, sustainability planning even. So there's a ton of these kinds of resources that are free. You know, you can look into the ADDIC organizations, you know, that we have in the Midwest. Sometimes you can even ask them like, hey, could you consider doing a topic like this? I know with the HOPE Consortium, we do put out a training and TA survey every year. So when you have those opportunities, if this is something you want to learn more about, you know, go ahead and put it on those lists and you'll see the webinars pop up. And kind of one of those gifts of the pandemic is that a lot of these are free now, you know, because it's easier to deliver them and we can deliver them virtually like this. You could also just consider putting on a top hat and a monocle and writing that way. And I guarantee you, you will feel fancier. So I would be really glad to discuss all of this with you. Now, I love hearing from other people who've written grants and what your experiences are. I also just put here on this last slide, these are super small, you're not expected to read these, but I did include 2 handouts that I think Susan or Lana uploaded this morning onto the website. The first one is the handout that I was talking about where it talks about preparing to submit a federal grant. So the front side of that is really talking about that thing you can do now. So all those places that you have to register for to make sure that you're eligible to even submit a grant. This is the one that can take like 6 to 8 weeks to do. So that's worth doing before you even know you want to apply. Then on the back side or the second page, it's really talking about now that you've identified a funding opportunity, how do you actually go about doing the online application? And this part, I was shocked. I mean, I've been so spoiled by having a grants management and sponsored programs office as long as I've been, you know, submitting grants. And when I was working with Three Bridges to get this done, you know, I thought like, well, the instructions are right there. It can't be that hard. It was ridiculous. just the worst experience ever. And there were a lot of tears after that too, because I was afraid we weren't going to get that submitted after all of the hard work. But we did. And it's just the nuances. I tried to kind of call out some of the things that I just thought were not well defined anywhere else. And the nuances and like signing in as the eBiz POC versus signing in as an AOR. I mean, it just, I think it's a little silly, but I'm sure that there's a good reason for it. And then the other thing that I included, because I think most of you are in the fields of substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and recovery, I had given another presentation a while back where I had 2 slides that had a hyperlinked list of different funding sources for grants, and then also kind of data resources. So, you know, if you're looking for YRBS data or you're looking for population data, you know, whatever that might be, I included some of my kind of favorites on that list because it can be hard to find, especially living in these rural counties where, you know, anything where you have an N of less than 5, the data are basically suppressed, so we can't see it. And so it can be really hard sometimes to get good data about the counties that we serve and the communities that we serve. So those are just some of my favorites. Obviously, none of them are perfect. And in Wisconsin, a lot of the data are very old. So the other thing that you can do is there's on all of the data dashboards and things that the state of Wisconsin has, there's always like this, like, questions, email us. And those people are so awesome. If you email them, like I've gotten people to send me like at a moment's notice, like, hey, I need like ambulance run data for this county for this time period, like, and I need it by tomorrow. And, you know, I've had really good luck with them being very responsive. So it seems to me like they kind of like it when they get to like show off about their data. So don't hesitate to contact them. So that's it. That's all I have, Megan. You know, I'm happy to answer questions or discuss anything with anyone. Now, I'm happy. I don't know what the protocol is, Megan, you'll have to share, but I'm happy if they're in the chat box, or if you wanted to turn off your, or turn on your camera or turn on your mic and ask away out loud.
Yeah, either way, whatever everyone feels comfortable with. You can either type your questions into the chat box, or if you want to unmute yourself and turn on your video, you can go ahead and ask your questions that way. We'd love to hear what you have to say.
I also did include my contact information. I'm working from home right now, so that's my cell phone with the weird area code, but I am a-okay with emails, texts, or calls. Like, I really do kind of nerd out about this kind of stuff. So if you have like a specific question about a specific grant, like, I'd love to connect with you. I mean, that's part of working for a federally qualified health center like FHC means that, you know, we understand that the health of our community improves the health of like all of us. And so we're tasked with serving the underserved, and we have a community majority board, which means that we're under the purview of people who are patients. Patients of our centers are the ones that tell us what we can and cannot do in our work. And so they've been very interested lately in how we can help bring more funds into communities, even if those funds aren't coming through us as an agency. So please don't hesitate to reach out, even if it's a very specific grant and you just have a question or you want to like float an idea by. I will say I'm not going to review all your grants, so probably don't send me like a finished grant and ask for my opinion. I'm not going to give it because I don't have time for that, but I would be happy to chat about any of those specific questions. I think it's fun, and I think it's important that, you know, we get these skills that, you know, they don't really teach, I feel like, anywhere. And yeah, Patty, there is a link to the slides. So I gave that to Lana and Susan, and I think it's in the same place that you registered. And I wonder if I can copy that out of the chat from earlier and put it down here, because this is the place where under my presentation, like under the date and title, it has the slides as well as the 2 handouts separately. They're all PDF'd. But if you want, like, also that's the other thing, if you want me to send you like the full size slides or anything, you can go ahead and email me. I didn't put them on there because I know it's kind of a pain. Not everybody has PowerPoint on their computer, but I can send those to you as well.
Rachel, it looks like
Jenna.
Oh,
hey, Jenna.
Go ahead, Jenna.
Hey, I really enjoyed your presentation. I had my first RFA writing experience this past year, and luckily I had a mentor that brought a lot of the points home that you had said, but I was going in quite clueless. So I just smile with some of the points that you make because I'm like, yes, that's so true. I don't know if you touched on this, but like picking your battles with grants, like how do you pick and choose like what to pursue versus what not to pursue? I mean, like, I know historically on our team at the health department, we're looking for big, like, long-term, this is going to fund someone's work for
Right.
X amount of years versus this is a mini grant that's going to last 3 months.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And that's a hard question too, because like, especially in my role now, you know, when a partner agency approaches us and says, what do you think about applying for this grant? You know, my knee-jerk reaction, actually, I'm going to turn this off, stop the sharing so I can see better. But my knee-jerk reaction is always to say yes. Like I'm a yes sayer. I want, like bring in funds. Funds are great, except, you're right. Like you can't apply for everything. You spend all of your time chasing everything. And there are so many considerations. And I think first and foremost, you have to consider your personal capacity. So who's going to write this grant, and do they actually have the time and energy right now to write the grant? Because I've spent a lot of like late nights and long weekends, writing grants that maybe we shouldn't have gone for because it was just too much to ask of myself or of my colleagues. There are times when the timeline is just too tight and it's not doable. The other considerations are how well aligned are the activities. If you're stretching your department to kind of meet all the requirements, or you're stretching your agency or your staff to meet all the requirements of the grant beyond just the things that you want to do, but the things that they say you have to do, it's probably not worth it. And you make another really good point about like the sustainability. So some funders ask you to develop a sustainability plan, and that can be valuable, but you kind of need time and energy and resources to do that. Like you can't just sustain something out of nothing. So some of these grants that are smaller, like $15,000 or $20,000, where they ask you to like put together a sustainability plan, I'm like, give me $15,000 for a sustainability plan alone. I mean, it takes a lot of time and energy to do that. And so anything you put under how you're going to sustain it is probably not going to be true. You can't do that. And especially the other thing to think about is how much money it is. So if you have a person who's like, currently 0.7 FTE, and they're real interested in picking up some more hours and maybe going to like 0.85 or 0.9, and this is just a small grant, it would supplement that person, that might be a great way to like keep that person who's maybe very valuable to your agency working in your agency. But if it's a small amount and like you can't actually hire anyone for 0.1 FTE, I mean, who's going to do that unless you have a consultant already in mind? I mean, that's just not tenable for somebody who's trying to work full time or support themselves making a living at this. So there's a lot of considerations, and it is so hard to decide, and especially when it feels like a good fit otherwise, to say no. But those conversations, I think they're difficult and they're worth having. And I gotta say, in the last I'd say probably 2 years, I've said no more than any other time period in my life, because like I said, like there's a ton of money coming out in substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and recovery. And I think that there's going to be a lot more with some of the recent stimulus money that passed. I've heard that there's going to be like millions and billions of dollars coming to states and to public health departments and to hospitals and clinic systems. And it's going to be hard to spend all of that, but you really have to think carefully about what the direction you want your agency to go and how well aligned that grant is with your vision kind of for your agency in general. We just passed on a big one. We could have applied for another RCORE grant. So we have the RCORE Neonatal Abstinence Syndrome grant, which is in the same region as the HOPE Consortium. And one of our technical assistance providers was encouraging us to apply for an RCORE implementation grant to supplement that and kind of get us over I lost a really big grant. Okay, I don't want to say I lost it, but we didn't get a really huge grant, and I was pretty devastated. And she was like, well, why don't you apply for this one to like make up the difference? And, we thought about it, and I think we'd get it if we applied, but I don't want to do it. And I don't have the capacity to do it right now. And I don't think any of my teammates do either. So we decided to pass on that one, even though that was a hard decision. So I think that there's a lot of considerations, and ultimately, like as annoying as this is, it's kind of a personal decision and something that you and your colleagues have to make based on whatever is most important to you. Sorry for that long-winded non-answer.
Hey, Rachel, there was another question that came through the chat. Do you know a good website for practice templates?
Practice, like
I'm assuming like a grant practice template.
I don't. That's not something. So it's interesting. I feel like there's a lot of the same thing happens in publishing, and I see it happening more and more in current like grant writing too. Is there's a lot of stuff that like is hidden behind paywalls. For example, there are people making money off of training you how to write a grant, and I don't know. I don't love that because I feel like it's taking advantage of agencies that are already struggling. So if there's ever anything like, you have a question about, like, I would be happy to send you some examples. I think one of the best things that I've ever done is read other people's grants, so I get a lot of ideas based on like what they do. So I don't have any great recommendations for like a specific website for templates, but if you talk to some of your colleagues, for example, that have gotten those like grants or similar grants, I know like, for example, for a TAD grant, we contacted Justice Point, which is a nonprofit organization that helps other entities in Wisconsin and Minnesota to develop, treatment courts in their counties. And they had all kinds of materials. So there could be some of those things out there that are just, maybe not available online, or, I just would be wary of anything that they put behind a paywall or ask you to register for, you know, this like 6-part series that'll make all your dreams come true. It just, those to me feel a little bit predatory.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
I just have a quick question for you. So I'm completely new to grant writing, and I'm currently interning at a homeless shelter, and just kind of analyzing where we have some gaps in services. And I was really interested to hear what you had said about people coming out of jail and having nowhere to go and going back to using. And we see that a lot, you know, people just getting dropped off. And, you know, one of our policies is that we have a no tolerance policy. And I see that people struggle because they're expected to stay sober, and they have really, they don't have a support system at all. And so I'm kind of just been starting to research this grant process, but for me, I really don't know where to start or who to contact, or to even, like you said, partnering with people, because we, like, our community could really use more treatment services. Or for
Do you
instance,
mind
like in our
sharing what county you're in? Do you mind sharing your county?
I'm sorry, Barron County.
Oh, Barron. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's, you know, like, we can really help with our case management as far as finding housing and employment and helping get their health care and food share and those sorts of things with our case management. But the health care portion and the mental health and substance abuse portion, I feel like we're really falling short on. And unless you can really wrap all that around together, it's hard for people to keep their housing and their employment if they start using again. And
yeah, well, and it's such a chicken and egg situation too, because I feel like for a lot of people, finding recovery is a very difficult thing to do when you have that much housing instability. I mean, that's not, you know, so there's lots of different schools with that. And it's an interesting question that you raised, because that's an issue that we're currently trying to address through the Central Wisconsin Partnership for Recovery, which is an R-Corps funded program through HRSA. And we have funds to address, you know, some of those issues in Wood and Clark County. And we keep reminding ourselves that if it was an easy problem to solve, somebody would have done it already. So I applaud you for doing your internship there and being interested in continuing to pursue the problem, because it's a huge problem. And I know what you're talking about in terms of these grants are very difficult to identify. Housing in particular exists at a really difficult place between treatment and housing specifically. So like HUD funding, for example, has a lot of limitations on it about, you know, a person's sobriety, or whether it has to be housing first versus, you know, adding different services. And then treatment funding also has really like strong kind of guidelines or even rules, restrictions related to what has to be delivered for it to be eligible for treatment funding versus housing funding. And I feel like both of these like silos tend to push people back and forth. Like, oh, you're dealing with homeless people, but really they have an addiction, so you should go over there. And oh, you're dealing with addiction, but really that person has a housing issue, you should go over there. And so there's this middle ground that I think has been really, really difficult for people to exist in, especially when substance use disorder and mental health concerns are at either the root of the problem so often, or something that has to be addressed before a person is going to be successful in their housing kind of search, especially if you want it to be long-term independent housing. So I know that's not a good answer, but I mean, that's like acknowledging the fact that like you're in a really difficult position. When it comes to partnerships, that's kind of like what we're finding to be the best way to go. So if you can identify a treatment center that's in your area and say, hey, like, we're willing to provide temporary housing to this person if you can provide intensive treatment. So that gets you around. Then, you know, you have rules and regulations related to housing. They have rules and regulations related to treatment, but you get out of that murky area of residential treatment. So sometimes it's as little as finding a grant to fund transportation from this temporary housing facility to the treatment center, you know, on a regular basis. There have been some places that are even like co-located, not co-located, but I don't remember if it was maybe Missouri, where they were talking about there was a treatment center on one side of the parking lot and a homeless shelter on the other side of the parking lot. And so neither of them were doing, like, the homeless shelter was not doing treatment and the treatment center was not doing housing, but it was just this really great like synergistic relationship. It's so hard though, I feel like in northern and rural parts of Wisconsin, because transportation is another huge issue for our folks, and MTM is unreliable to say the least. So is such a difficult problem. And I think that the way that we're getting closer to the solution, and I can't say this for sure, obviously, because we have not solved the problem ourselves, but is definitely through that partnership. And so we've got more people around the table than ever before. We're starting to look at the Wisconsin balance of state continuum of care. I think that you're part of the same one in Barron County that Clark is part of, which is weird because they're not close, but they're starting to ramp things up. And I think the best way to go is to keep going to collaborative meetings and raising your problem at every one of them. And I feel like those relationships will help you make more connections. We recently expanded our Hope Consortium North region into the Central region. So that includes Clark, Jackson, Portage, and Wood counties. And it was interesting because the DHS area administrator from over in the western part of the state, so which would include Barron County, he started attending and he was like, oh, you guys are addressing housing. Can I connect with that, through the other projects? So, there's been a lot of connections made. And I think sometimes that's kind of the best thing that you can do until a very clear, pathway kind of resolves itself in front of you. I think that the homelessness in particular, and as it intersects with substance use and mental health, is kind of the biggest problem of the moment everywhere. I know also one of the things that we're encouraging some of our transitional housing partners to do is to reconsider their policy on okay, so if you say no use on site, but are you doing UAs too? If you're not doing UAs, well, you're not using on site, you're not endangering anyone. Okay, so I mean, because that's another issue too, even with sober living facilities, where if they have a zero tolerance policy and somebody is kicked out immediately upon identification of use, then where do they go? I mean, there may literally be nowhere to go. So all of those things are super complex because you're stuck in a hard place between keeping the existing residents safe and helping that person to be successful. So I would just, I guess, encourage you to reach out as much as possible. In Barron County, I think that's where the Red Cedar Church, is that in Barron? Yeah.
Yes.
So I know that they've been, and I don't know what Chris Fitzgerald and all of the group there are doing now, but I know that they had a ton of collaborative efforts around some of the, recovery friendly practices. And it may be worth connecting with that group and those, coalitions to figure out if there's a way to move forward together.
He's on the board.
Oh, there you go.
The shelter, yeah.
And he hasn't solved your
I've had to
problem.
talk to
Great.
The executive director, yes.
Yeah. So, well. I was hoping maybe he'd have the answer. But the other thing that you could do is reach out to your DHS area administrators. A lot of times they have their pulse kind of on other things that are going on in a region. And so that's how Zach Todd, who's the DHS area administrator over on the Western region, it's been really interesting getting connected to other resources through him. Also the policy and program analysts through the Department of Community Corrections. So I think Jean Olson would be the one over in your region, and he's been he obviously has work that intersects with you because folks that are on probation and parole are frequently in need of housing and struggle to find it because of felony convictions or eviction histories, and so he's been very interested in the housing issue as well. But they often, I feel like folks like that who are kind of overseeing these regions often go to a lot of these different meetings and might be able to connect you to other partners. I wish I could tell you that there was a great funding source. It's been really, really challenging. And even with the HRSA money that we do have, we're a community health center. We can't put up a house or anything brick and mortar. So the best we can do is support things like first month's rent, but even then, are you setting someone up to fail if you give them first month's rent, but you don't give them the supportive services they need to be successful in an independent living situation? So it's a very complex problem, and it does make for a compelling story though in any grant you want to write. If you do identify that grant, you can tell a really nice story about the differences it can make. And I've seen Portage County has a very cool rent ready program that they've implemented, and they had a news story on the WAOW news channel, and it was just like a tearjerker. It was great. And so I feel like those kinds of things can get a community behind these types of projects. The guy had kids, which is always a winner, for a story.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. We are out of time, but thanks, Rachel. Your presentation was awesome. I only wrote a grant once in grad school, so it was a good refresher and a lot of personal tips. So appreciate everyone for attending. And like Rachel mentioned, and she put the link in the chat as well, the handouts and the slides from today will be available on that webpage, and the recording will be available in a few days as well. So thank you so much for everyone for coming and attending.
Yeah, thank you.
And Rachel.
Megan.